"I'll take the fat one," the giant Amish man said as he pointed at the trembling labor girl offered for $5. The crowd roared with laughter, thinking it was a cruel joke, but they didn't see what he saw. Dust swirled around the auction block as the girl's eyes filled with shame, and then surprise, because the giant didn't mock her. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and walked her out through the jeers, whispering a quiet prayer. Out on the frozen trail, she waited for cruelty, but found mercy instead. Yet in a town built on greed and railroad lies, kindness can be the most dangerous act of all. When the foreman swore to take her back, and the law rode up the mountain, the snow itself seemed to hold its breath. What secret does this girl carry that could bring down an empire? And how far will one outcast man go to protect the only soul who ever believed in him? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The bitter November wind cut through the rail yard, carrying the acrid smell of coal smoke and desperation. Wooden crates served as an auction block, their rough surface worn smooth by countless souls who'd stood upon them, waiting to be sold into labor contracts. The crowd of bidders hunched in their heavy coats, breath-forming clouds in the cold air. Hazel wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her stockings offering little protection against the biting chill. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stood exposed before the jeering faces. The foreman, a man with yellowed teeth and snake-mean eyes, grabbed her arm roughly. $5, he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. That's all I'm asking for this one. Surely someone needs a strong back for their work. He paused, letting his cruel smile widen. Though you'll have to feed her plenty, as you can see. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Hazel's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her chin high, the way her mama had taught her before the fever took both her parents. A few men called out crude jokes, pointing and guffawing at her expense. Then the crowd parted like water around a stone. A tall figure stepped forward, his broad-brimmed black hat marking him as Amish, though his beard was shorter than tradition demanded. His boots were worn but well cared for, and his plain, dark coat spoke of simple dignity. The foreman's smile faltered as Sebastian Yoder approached the platform. The big man's presence seemed to fill the space, though he moved with the quiet grace of someone used to handling skittish cattle. Without a word, he reached into his vest and pulled out $5 silver. "I'll take the fat one," he said, his voice steady and clear. The words themselves might have been cruel, but his tone held no mockery, just simple statement of fact, like accepting the weather or the turning of seasons. Fresh laughter burst from the crowd, but it died quickly when Sebastian turned his steady gaze upon them. He set the coins deliberately in the foreman's palm, then shrugged off his heavy wool coat. With gentle hands, he wrapped it around Hazel's shoulders. The warmth of the coat enveloped her, carrying the scent of wood smoke and leather. Hazel stood frozen, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to reveal itself as just another cruel joke. But Sebastian's weather-worn face showed only patience as he guided her down from the crates. His wagon waited at the edge of the rail yard, a sturdy brown mare stamping her hooves against the cold. Sebastian helped Hazel up onto the wooden seat, making sure she was settled before climbing up beside her. The leather reins creaked as he took them in his calloused hands. As they pulled away from the rail yard, the sun was setting behind the water tower, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose. The wagon wheels crunched over gravel, then dirt, as they headed toward the foothills that rose dark against the dying light. Hazel sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. She'd learned early that kindness often had sharp teeth hidden behind its smile. But as the miles rolled past, Sebastian made no demands, asked no questions. Instead, a soft sound began to fill the gathering dusk. He was humming, a gentle, flowing melody that spoke of peace and comfort. Hazel recognized it as a hymn, though not one she knew. The simple tune wrapped around her like a second coat, and she felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. The wagon swayed steadily beneath them as Sebastian guided the mare along the rutted road. Away from the rail yard's chaos, the evening was filled with cricket song and the distant cry of a whippoorwill. The air grew cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and sage from the hills ahead. Hazel stole glances at her new employer, trying to read his intentions in the set of his shoulders or the lines around his eyes. But Sebastian seemed content with the silence, broken only by his quiet humming and the regular clip-clop of the horse's hooves. For the first time since being roughly awakened that morning and dragged to the labor auction, Hazel allowed herself to take a full breath. She didn't know what waited at the end of this journey, but for now, wrapped in a warm coat and carried by that gentle hymn, she felt something she hadn't expected to find in the rail yard that day, a tiny spark of hope. The wagon continued on toward the foothills, two figures silhouetted against the sunset sky, one large, one small, both carrying their own weights of history and hurt, moving together into the gathering dark. The wagon creaked steadily away from Pine Junction, each turn of the wheels carrying them deeper into the gathering dusk. Hazel sat rigid on the wooden seat, her mind spinning with dark possibilities. She'd heard whispered stories of girls sold into worse than labor, tales that made her stomach clench with fear. The man beside her remained silent, his broad shoulders squared against the wind. The cold nipped at her cheeks, but Sebastian's coat kept the worst of it at bay. Its wool still held his warmth, smelling of wood smoke and honest work. After an hour of travel, he guided the mare off the main trail toward a frozen stream that cut through a small meadow. "We'll rest here a spell," Sebastian said, his voice gentle as he brought the wagon to a stop. He climbed down, his boots crunching in the frost-covered grass. Hazel watched, tense, as he reached into the wagon bed and brought out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Come," he said, offering his hand to help her down. "Share some supper with me." Hazel hesitated, then took his calloused hand. Her feet found the ground, and she followed him to a fallen log near the stream. The water moved sluggishly under a thin sheet of ice, its soft gurgle the only sound besides the evening wind in the pines. Sebastian unwrapped the bundle, revealing thick biscuits and strips of cold beef. He offered her the larger portion, but Hazel kept her hands folded in her lap, shame burning in her chest. She'd endured too many jokes about her appetite, too many cruel comments about her size. "Child," Sebastian said softly, reading her hesitation. "God made strong hands to lift others." He broke a biscuit in half, studying it thoughtfully. "And he made hungry bellies to remind us to be grateful for his bounty." He held the food out to her again, his eyes kind. This time, Hazel accepted. The biscuit was dense and slightly sweet, the beef well seasoned and tender. She ate slowly at first, then with growing appetite as Sebastian showed no sign of mockery or judgment. When night settled fully around them, Sebastian led the mare to drink from a shallow part of the stream, then unhitched her from the wagon. He arranged a small camp, his movements efficient and practiced. True to his Amish upbringing, he gathered only the fallen wood they needed, building a modest fire that cast dancing shadows on their faces. "Best get some rest," he said, spreading a thick blanket near the fire for her. "We've a few hours yet to travel come morning." Hazel wrapped herself in the blanket, Sebastian's coat still draped over her shoulders. The fire's warmth seeped into her tired bones as she watched her strange benefactor kneel in the firelight. His voice carried softly on the night air as he prayed, thanking God for safe passage and asking blessing for their journey ahead. The simple sincerity in his words touched something deep in Hazel's heart. She'd stopped praying after her parents died, feeling abandoned by God. But Sebastian's quiet devotion held no bitterness, only gratitude and peace. Her eyes grew heavy as his prayer continued, and she drifted to sleep with his gentle words washing over her. Dawn broke crystal clear and cold, painting the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold. They ate a simple breakfast of the remaining biscuits, then continued their journey as the sun climbed higher. The land changed around them, rising into the foothills where pine trees stood like sentinels against the morning frost. Finally, Sebastian guided the wagon around a bend, and Hazel saw their destination. A modest cabin stood in a small clearing, smoke rising from its stone chimney. Behind it, a larger building that must be the smokehouse sent thin wisps of fragrant smoke into the air. The buildings weren't fancy, but they were well-maintained, with neat stacks of firewood along the walls and clean-swept paths between them. Sebastian brought the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. "This is home," he said simply, helping Hazel down. "You'll help with chores here." He studied her face for a moment, noting the exhaustion that lined it. "But first, you need rest. There's a bed made up inside." Hazel stood in the crisp morning air, taking in the peaceful scene before her. The distant mountains rose blue against the sky, and somewhere in the pines, a bird called out its morning song. Here, far from the jeering crowds and cruel laughter of Pine Junction, something shifted in her heart. For the first time since her parents' deaths, since being forced into labor that bent her back but never broke her spirit, Hazel felt the ice around her heart begin to thaw. In this place, with this quiet man who offered kindness without demands, she sensed something she'd almost forgotten existed: safety. The morning sun filtered through frost-covered windows as Hazel stirred from the deepest sleep she'd known in years. A warm, sweet aroma drifted through the cabin, cornbread baking. Her stomach rumbled as she slowly sat up in the small but comfortable bed. Sebastian stood at the iron stove, his broad back turned to her. He wore simple suspenders over a clean work shirt, sleeves rolled past his elbows as he tended to breakfast. Without his coat and hat, he looked less imposing but no less dignified. Hazel's feet touched the wooden floor, and Sebastian turned at the sound. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying its usual gentle tone. "I trust you slept well." She nodded, unable to remember the last time someone had asked about her rest. The cabin looked different in daylight, simple but orderly, with a few handmade quilts adding spots of color to the walls. "The table's set," Sebastian said, pulling golden cornbread from the oven. "We'll break fast together." Hazel moved cautiously to the table, where 2 plates waited. Sebastian placed the steaming cornbread between them, along with a jar of honey and some fresh butter. He seated himself across from her and bowed his head. "Dear Lord," he began, his voice soft but clear, "we thank you for this food and the gift of a new day. Watch over Hazel as she begins her life here, and guide my hands in caring for her as you would have me do. Amen." Tears welled in Hazel's eyes, and she quickly blinked them away. Her name, he'd spoken her name in prayer. Not girl or fat one, or any of the cruel names she'd grown used to hearing. Just Hazel, spoken with respect and care. They ate in comfortable silence, the cornbread warm and sweet. When the meal was done, Sebastian rose. "I'll show you around today. You should know the place you'll call home." The morning air bit cold as they stepped outside. Sebastian led her first to a small chicken coop, where a dozen hens pecked at scattered feed. "These ladies give us eggs," he explained, "and sometimes entertainment." As if to prove his point, 2 hens began squabbling over the same kernel of corn, making Hazel smile despite herself. The smokehouse stood larger than it had seemed yesterday, its wooden walls darkened by years of use. Inside, rows of hams hung from the rafters, filling the air with a rich, smoky scent. "This is my trade," Sebastian explained, pointing out the different stages of curing. "Travelers and traders stop here regular, knowing they can get good meat for their journey." Hazel listened carefully as he described the process: the salting, the smoking, the careful timing needed for each piece. Her quick mind gathered the details, storing them away. Back in the cabin, she spotted a bucket and brush near the door. "I can clean the floors," she offered, eager to show her worth. "I'm good at scrubbing." Sebastian nodded. "Much obliged, but pace yourself, there's no rush here." As Hazel worked, moving carefully across the wooden planks, she felt Sebastian's presence as a comfort rather than a threat. He moved about his own tasks, never hovering, never demanding more speed. When evening approached, she finally reached the hearth. There, tucked on a small shelf, she noticed something that made her pause. A wooden carving, no bigger than her palm, showed a small boy holding a toy horse. The craftsmanship was fine, each detail lovingly rendered. Sebastian saw where her gaze had landed. He crossed the room slowly and picked up the carving, his large hands cradling it gently. "My son," he said quietly. "Jacob, he and my Sarah, my wife, they passed 5 winters ago. Fever took them both." He sat heavily in his chair by the fire, still holding the carving. "It was just after I'd been cast out from my order. I'd stood against a mob that meant to harm a half-Cherokee child. They said I broke our ways by raising my voice, by standing between them and violence." His voice grew distant with memory. "Maybe they were right about the raising of voices, but I couldn't stand silent and watch harm come to an innocent." Through the window, snow had begun to fall, large flakes drifting past like feathers. Hazel set down her brush and moved closer to the fire. She understood now. This man knew what it meant to be alone, to be judged, to lose everything that mattered. "I'm sorry for your loss," she whispered, the words feeling small against such grief. But they were all she had to offer. Sebastian's eyes met hers, and in them she saw recognition. The shared understanding of those who have known deep sorrow. He nodded once, acknowledging her words and the heart behind them, as the snow continued to fall outside their warm circle of firelight. 2 days had passed since Hazel's confession by the fire. The winter morning dawned crisp and clear as Sebastian and Hazel worked together on the smokehouse roof. Sebastian's large hands moved steadily, replacing worn shingles while Hazel passed him tools and fresh cedar shakes from her perch on the ladder. "Mind your footing up there," Sebastian called softly, his breath visible in the cold air. Hazel nodded, carefully shifting her weight. The work felt good, honest, and useful. She'd already learned that Sebastian never rushed her, never shouted when she made mistakes. The thunder of hooves drew their attention. 3 riders appeared on the road below, their horses kicking up dust despite the morning frost. They slowed as they passed, studying the pair on the roof with unconcealed suspicion. Hazel recognized one as a regular at the railroad yard and shrunk behind a chimney stack. Sebastian kept working, his movements deliberate and calm, though his eyes followed the riders until they disappeared around the bend. "Best we finish before the weather turns," he said. But Hazel noticed how he positioned himself between her and the road. Down in Pine Junction, the same riders pulled their horses up outside the railroad office. Inside, Gus Ketterly sat at his desk, a bottle of whiskey within easy reach despite the early hour. His face darkened as they reported what they'd seen. "That fat girl I lost at auction?" Ketterly spat, his voice thick with anger. "Living with that Amish giant up in the hills?" He slammed his ledger shut, the sound making his visitors jump. "She's my contracted labor, fair and square. I've got papers saying so." He pushed back from his desk, swaying slightly as he stood. "That girl knows things she shouldn't. Saw too much when she worked near my office." His bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Can't have her running loose, telling tales." Within the hour, Ketterly had Deputy Cole's ear. The lawman stood uncomfortably in the railroad office, thumbing the brim of his hat as Ketterly waved a stack of papers. "She's a runaway debtor," Ketterly insisted. "That German farmer's harboring her illegal. You've got to investigate, Deputy. Law's the law." Cole nodded slowly, though something in his eyes suggested reluctance. "I'll ride up tomorrow, see what's what." Back at the cabin, evening settled in with a bitter wind. Sebastian and Hazel sat at the kitchen table, lamplight casting warm shadows as he showed her how to mend feed sacks with neat, strong stitches. His large fingers demonstrated the pattern with surprising grace. "Like this?" Hazel asked, copying his technique. "Yeah, exactly so," Sebastian smiled. "You have a quick hand for it." Neither knew that down below the ridge, in a ramshackle tavern, Ketterly was buying drinks for a group of rough men. Their voices grew louder with each round as they planned how they'd fetch her back come morning. Hazel's needle paused mid-stitch. The familiar fear she'd been holding back finally spilled out. "Sebastian?" Her voice trembled slightly. "There's something you should know." He set down his work, giving her his full attention. "When I worked for the railroad," she continued, "I cleaned near Mr. Ketterly's office. She swallowed hard. "I saw things, papers that showed how he cheated people, how he sold labor contracts that were already paid off." Sebastian listened quietly, his face grave but gentle. "He's a cruel man," Hazel whispered. "If he finds out I know about his schemes, he'll hurt us both, maybe worse." Sebastian reached across the table, his weathered hand covering her shaking one. "Hazel," he said softly. "Listen well. Evil works fast because it fears the light. But truth?" He smiled slightly. "Truth may walk slow, but it always reaches home." Hazel met his steady gaze, drawing strength from his certainty. "Come," Sebastian said, rising from the table. "Time for evening prayer." They knelt together by the hearth, where the carved figure of Jacob still stood watch. Sebastian's deep voice filled the cabin with words of faith and protection, asking the Lord to shield them in the coming days. Hazel closed her eyes, adding her own silent plea for courage. The fire crackled low as they finished praying. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its cry carrying over the ridge where men plotted in their cups. But inside the cabin, wrapped in lamplight and trust in God's care, Hazel felt her fear begin to ease. Whatever came with morning, she was no longer alone. The next afternoon's sun hung low over the pines, casting long shadows across Sebastian's property. He stood at the cabin door, pausing in his work of stacking firewood when he spotted a lone figure on horseback approaching along the ridge trail. The rider's badge glinted in the winter light, Deputy Cole, carrying what looked like an official paper. Sebastian's heart tightened, but his face remained calm. He turned slightly toward the smokehouse where Hazel worked. "Inside, child," he whispered, just loud enough to carry. Through the corner of his eye, he saw her slip behind the building, quick and quiet as a shadow. The deputy's horse kicked up small clouds of dust as it picked its way down the path. Sebastian waited, his hands relaxed at his sides, while Cole dismounted and hitched his horse to the rail. "Afternoon, Mr. Yoder," Cole said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice carried a forced politeness that didn't reach his eyes. "Got business with you today." Sebastian inclined his head. "Deputy." Cole pulled a folded paper from his vest, its red wax seal bearing Pine Junction's mark. "Got word you're harboring a fugitive. Girl named Hazel. She owes wages to the railroad company." He held out the document. "Need to take her back to town." Sebastian made no move to take the paper. "There is no lawful contract," he said quietly but firmly. "She was sold free and clear at public auction." "That ain't how Mr. Ketterly tells it." Cole shifted his weight, uncomfortable under Sebastian's steady gaze. "Says she ran from a prior agreement. Shows here in black and white." He waggled the paper. "A contract built on lies holds no weight before God or man," Sebastian replied. The deputy's face hardened. "Now listen here, Yoder. I ain't asking. That girl comes with me. or you'll face arrest for interference with company business." His hand drifted toward his gun belt. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sebastian stood unmoved, like one of the great pines that sheltered his home. "I will not deliver an innocent child into bondage." Cole stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Have it your way, but this ain't over." He mounted up, turning his horse back toward town. "You've got till sundown tomorrow to change your mind." Sebastian watched until the deputy disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he move, walking with measured steps to where Hazel crouched behind the smokehouse. She huddled against the rough logs, tears streaming down her face. "Child," he said gently, kneeling beside her despite his bad knee, "the Lord has not brought us this far to abandon us now." Hazel wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "But what will we do? They'll come back with more men." Sebastian closed his eyes, his deep voice falling into prayer. "Lord, grant us wisdom in this hour. Show us the path through darkness into light. Give us strength to stand for what is right, though the way be hard." When he finished, determination had settled over his features. "We'll seek counsel from Preacher Greyhawk," he said. "He understands the ways of both law and mercy." "The Cherokee minister?" Hazel asked. She had heard whispers about the preacher who rode circuit between settlements, defending those caught between worlds. Sebastian nodded. "Elijah Greyhawk has helped many who faced false judgment. He'll know how to protect you proper and legal." He rose, offering Hazel his hand. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow." They spent the evening preparing. Sebastian packed carefully, bread wrapped in clean cloth, strips of smoked venison, his well-worn Bible with its Pennsylvania Dutch notations in the margins. Hazel filled water skins and gathered extra blankets, her movements quick with nervous energy. As the sky began to pale toward dawn, they loaded the wagon. Sebastian banked the cabin's fire carefully, leaving enough wood to keep smoke rising from the chimney. "Let them think we're still here," he explained. "Gives us time to reach the preacher." The morning star still shone bright when they set out, frost crunching under the wagon wheels. Sebastian clicked softly to the horses while Hazel huddled beside him, wrapped in his spare coat. Behind them, thin smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, a peaceful sight that belied the tension in their hearts. Neither spoke for a long while, listening instead to the creak of leather harness and the steady clip of hooves. Finally, Hazel broke the silence. "Why do you risk so much? For me?" Sebastian kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but his voice was gentle. "Because every soul bears God's image, child, even those the world calls worthless." He glanced at her. "Especially those." The sun began to rise through the trees as they drove on, searching for the man who might help them stand against injustice. Behind them, the smoke from Sebastian's chimney rose straight and true into the crystal morning air, a last reminder of the peace they left behind. Frost-glazed ruts made the wagon wheels struggle as Sebastian and Hazel followed the valley road. The morning's bright promise had faded to a pewter sky that threatened snow. Their horses, breath steaming in the cold air, picked their way carefully down the slope. Sebastian noticed Hazel huddling deeper into his spare coat. "There's another blanket behind the seat," he offered quietly. She shook her head. "I'm fine." After a moment's hesitation, she added, "Been through worse winters. At least now I've got a proper coat." The wagon creaked as they navigated a particularly deep rut. Hazel gripped the seat's edge, then seemed to come to a decision. "I reckon I should tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about why the foreman's really after me." Sebastian kept his eyes on the trail, but tilted his head to show he was listening. "I was 12 when Ma and Pa died of the fever," Hazel began. "No kin to take me in. Foreman Ketterly offered what he called a hiring contract. Said I could work off my parents' doctor bills. Her fingers twisted in the coat's worn fabric. But the debt never got smaller, no matter how many hours I worked. Always some new charge added on. The ways of wickedness run deep, Sebastian said softly. Hazel nodded. One night when I was cleaning his office, I found his ledger. The real one, not the one he shows to the company men. She swallowed hard. It showed everything. How he was cheating all of us laborers, especially the children and widows. I took it. Sebastian's hands tightened slightly on the reins. Where is it now? Under my bed back at the labor camp, hidden in my old straw mattress. Hazel's voice shook. I was going to show someone, but I got scared. That's when he started saying I'd stolen money from him. Next thing I knew, I was up for auction. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. That ledger, he said finally, might be God's way of bringing truth to light. They traveled on through the afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and share some bread and dried meat. As dusk approached, they spotted smoke rising from a modest wooden chapel nestled against the riverbank. A figure in a dark coat stood in the doorway, as if expecting them. Preacher Elijah Greyhawk stepped forward as Sebastian drew the wagon to a halt. His weathered face creased in a welcoming smile. Brother Sebastian, he said warmly, I thought I might be seeing you soon. Word travels fast in troubled times. Friend Elijah, Sebastian replied, helping Hazel down from the wagon. We come seeking counsel. And you shall have it. The preacher gestured toward the chapel door. But first, coffee and warmth. The Lord's wisdom flows better by a good fire. Inside, the chapel was plain but welcoming. A pot of coffee bubbled on the wood stove, and lamplight gleamed on simple wooden pews. Greyhawk poured 3 cups, while Sebastian and Hazel settled on a bench near the heat. Now then, the preacher said, once they each held steaming cups. Tell me what brings you down from your smokehouse on such a cold evening. They took turns explaining, Sebastian describing the auction and Deputy Cole's visit, Hazel revealing the truth about the ledger. Greyhawk listened intently, his dark eyes thoughtful. When they finished, the preacher set his cup aside. That ledger, he said carefully, could expose more than just one foreman's crimes. The whole system of forced labor, what they call hiring contracts, it's spread through half the territories. He looked at Hazel. No wonder they're so eager to silence you, child. What should we do? Sebastian asked. Greyhawk stood, pacing slowly before the stove. The law's being twisted to serve injustice, but it might still be our strongest ally, if we can prove the truth. He turned to face them. That ledger needs to be retrieved quietly, before they can use legal force to stop you both. With it, we could bring this before the territorial judge. But how? Hazel asked. They'll be watching the labor camp now. Leave that part to me, Greyhawk said. I still have friends among both settlers and Cherokee. We'll find a way. He smiled gently at Hazel's worried expression. The good book says truth is like water. It finds its way through any crack, no matter how small. Sebastian nodded slowly. Then we'll trust in that truth, and in God's guidance. Outside, the river murmured in the gathering dark, while inside the chapel, 3 souls bent their heads together, planning how to bring light to long-hidden shadows. 2 nights of waiting at Greyhawk's chapel had made Hazel restless. The moon hung like a thin silver blade in the sky as she and Sebastian guided their horses along the shadowy trail back toward Pine Junction. Neither spoke much. The weight of their mission pressed heavily on both their hearts. Sebastian had traded his broad-brimmed hat for a darker one that wouldn't catch moonlight. His massive form seemed to blend with the night as he led them through back paths and deer trails. Hazel marveled at how such a large man could move so quietly when needed. As they approached the edge of town, Sebastian drew his horse close to Hazel's. "Remember what we planned," he whispered. Quick and quiet, like morning dew. Hazel nodded, her throat too tight for words. The railroad yard's skeletal shapes loomed ahead: water tower, loading cranes, and stacks of timber casting long shadows in the starlight. They dismounted behind the freight office and secured their horses to a fallen log, well hidden from the main road. The labor camp sprawled behind the yard, a cluttered maze of canvas tents and crude wooden shelters. Hazel's heart hammered as she recognized the path to her old bunk. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Sebastian touched her shoulder gently. "The Lord goes before us," he murmured. It wasn't quite a prayer, but it steadied her just the same. They crept between the tents, pausing whenever night sounds broke the silence. A dog barking in the distance, the crunch of gravel under unseen boots. Hazel led them to a weathered shack that had housed 8 young workers. The door creaked as she eased it open. Inside, moonlight filtered through gaps in the walls, painting silver stripes across empty bunks. The musty smell of old straw and unwashed blankets brought back memories Hazel wished she could forget. She knelt beside her old bed, little more than a wooden frame with a thin mattress. Her fingers found the loose floorboard, prying it up carefully. There, wrapped in a scrap of old cloth, lay the foreman's black ledger. Just touching it made her hands shake. Sebastian kept watch by the door, his broad shoulders tense. Suddenly he stiffened. "Someone's coming," he breathed. Voices drifted through the night, one harsh and familiar that made Hazel's blood run cold. Foreman Ketterly. "Check every bunk," he was saying. "That ledger's got to be here somewhere." A rougher voice answered, "Yes, sir, Mr. Ketterly. Nobody's getting past Jake Wheeler tonight." A lantern's glow appeared between the tents, growing stronger. Sebastian grabbed Hazel's arm and pulled her toward the back of the shack. She clutched the ledger to her chest, wrapping it in her shawl. They pressed themselves behind a stack of empty supply crates just as the door swung wide. The lantern beam swept across the bunks, inches from their hiding place. Hazel held her breath, feeling Sebastian's steadying hand on her shoulder. "Nothing here, boss," Wheeler growled, kicking at the loose floorboard Hazel hadn't had time to replace. "Keep looking," Ketterly snapped. "That girl's gotta have hidden it somewhere." The light lingered for what felt like hours, but must have been only moments. Finally, the door banged shut, and the voices moved away toward the next shelter. Sebastian nodded toward the back wall. Together, they slipped out through a gap between the boards. The night air felt sweet after the stuffy shack. They crouched low, working their way toward the cattle chute that led out of the yard. The wooden chute walls gave them cover as they hurried toward freedom. Somewhere behind them, Ketterly's voice rose in anger at finding another empty shelter. Hazel's heart pounded so hard she feared they would hear it. They reached their horses without being spotted. Sebastian helped Hazel mount quickly, then swung onto his own horse. They rode hard into the darkness, not slowing until the lights of Pine Junction were far behind them. Only when they reached the first rise of the foothills did they ease their horses to a walk. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, witnesses to their escape. The ledger pressed against Hazel's ribs beneath her shawl, each thump of the horse's hooves making it bump against her chest. "We did it," she whispered, still hardly daring to believe. "We have proof now." Sebastian nodded gravely. "Proof comes with peril," he said softly. "But the truth must have its day." They rode on through the star-scattered night, their horses' hooves making soft sounds against the rocky soil. The ledger that had cost Hazel so much to steal and now to retrieve might finally bring justice to those who had suffered under Ketterly's cruel system. She touched it through her shawl, feeling its solid presence like a promise. The first flakes of snow began falling just as false dawn painted the eastern sky in weak grays. What started as gentle white dots soon transformed into thick, swirling curtains that cut visibility to mere feet. The temperature plummeted, and bitter wind howled through the pines, driving ice-sharp crystals against their faces. Sebastian pulled his horse closer to Hazel's. "There's a place ahead," he called over the wind's roar. "A shelf of rock where travelers sometimes shelter." His words emerged in white puffs that the storm instantly shredded. They found the overhang just as full daylight should have arrived, though the storm had turned morning into a ghostly twilight. The rocky shelter cut deep enough into the hillside to protect them from the worst of the wind. Sebastian worked quickly to secure the horses close to the rock face, where they'd have some protection. "The poor creatures," Hazel said, noticing how their bay mare's legs trembled from cold and exhaustion. The horse's breath came in great steaming clouds. Sebastian gathered what dry wood he could find beneath the overhang, along with some pine needles. His huge hands, already red from cold, worked deliberately to arrange the tinder. "Fire's not just for warmth," he explained, striking his flint. "It keeps hope alive when the world turns white." The flames caught, but the wind threatened to snuff them out. They huddled close, feeding the fire carefully measured pieces of precious dry wood. Sebastian removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around Hazel's shoulders despite her protests. "You need it more than me," she insisted, trying to hand it back. He shook his head, a gentle smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "My father taught me many things before I left the order. One was to trust God's warmth even when your fingers can't feel it." He flexed his reddened hands. "The body shivers, but the soul stays warm if you let it." Hours crept by as the storm raged. They had to stay awake. Sleeping in such cold could mean death. Sebastian suggested they share stories to keep their minds alert. Hazel pulled his coat tighter, watching the flames dance. "I used to dream of teaching," she said softly. "Back in the labor camp, there was a little girl, couldn't have been more than 6. She'd never seen her name written down. I showed her how to spell it with a stick in the dirt." A smile touched her lips at the memory. Her eyes lit up like she'd just discovered magic. Sebastian nodded, adding a small branch to their fire. "Teaching is a sacred thing. It opens doors God meant to be opened. But who'd trust someone like me to teach their children?" Hazel's voice held old pain. "The foreman always said I was too nothing," Sebastian interrupted firmly. "You teach me something new each day. What could I possibly teach you?" His voice grew quiet, almost lost in the storm's howl. "How to hope again. After losing my family, my community. I thought hope had left me for good. But watching you face each day with courage, seeing you fight for justice instead of turning bitter." He paused, stoking the fire. "That teaches me more than any sermon." Hazel felt tears freeze on her cheeks. No one had ever spoken of her that way before. The storm began to ease as true dawn finally broke. The world beyond their shelter had transformed into a crystalline landscape. Every branch and rock wore a coating of ice that sparkled like diamonds in the new sunlight. When they checked the horses, they found their bay mare's legs showing signs of frostbite. The poor creature whinnied in pain when Sebastian gently touched the affected areas. "She'll live," he said after careful examination, "but we'll need to go slow and rest her often." They packed up their meager camp, making sure the fire was completely out. The ledger, still secure inside Hazel's shawl, had stayed dry through the night. That small book represented hope for so many, proof of the foreman's cruel system that had trapped countless desperate souls in endless labor. "Fort Calhoun's still 2 days' ride," Sebastian said, studying the white-glazed landscape. "Maybe 3, now that we need to take it easy with the mare." He helped Hazel mount her horse, then swung himself up onto his own. "The federal agent there is a fair man, from what Preacher Greyhawk tells me. He'll know what to do with the ledger." They set out across the glittering white world, moving carefully on the treacherous ground. Ice coated everything, making each step precarious. The sun struck rainbow colors from frozen branches, creating a beauty that seemed almost holy in its stillness. Hazel glanced at Sebastian, remembering his words about hope. The night's shared trial had forged something between them stronger than mere friendship or gratitude. They had become family in spirit, bound by something deeper than blood. The wooden gates of Fort Calhoun creaked open as Sebastian and Hazel approached on their weary horses. 2 days of hard riding had left them exhausted, their clothes still damp from melting snow. The American flag hung limp above the stockade, barely stirring in the bitter wind. A young sentry in a blue uniform stepped forward, musket held casually across his chest. "State your business." "We need to see Agent Marin," Sebastian said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "It's about railroad contracts." The sentry nodded and motioned for them to dismount. "Leave your horses here. I'll take you to him." Hazel's legs trembled as she slid from her saddle. The ledger pressed against her ribs beneath her shawl, its weight both comfort and burden. Sebastian placed a steadying hand on her shoulder as they followed the sentry across the muddy parade ground. The fort was smaller than Hazel had imagined, just a collection of log buildings arranged in a rough square around a central flagpole. Smoke rose from stone chimneys, and somewhere a blacksmith's hammer rang against iron. The sentry led them to a whitewashed cabin marked with a simple sign, Railroad Commission Office. Inside, Agent Marin sat behind a desk piled with papers. He was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and precisely trimmed side whisks. His black suit seemed out of place among the frontier surroundings. "Agent Marin," Sebastian said, removing his broad-brimmed hat. "We've come about irregularities in the railroad's labor contracts at Pine Junction." Marin's pen scratched across paper for several moments before he looked up. "Irregularities?" His voice was as precise as his appearance. Sebastian reached inside his coat and withdrew the ledger. "This belongs to Foreman Ketterly. It shows how he's been trapping people in debt, forcing them to work without fair wages." He placed the book on Marin's desk. The agent adjusted his spectacles and opened the ledger. His fingers traced down columns of numbers and names. With each page he turned, his expression grew tighter, more controlled. Hazel watched him anxiously. Something in his manner made her stomach clench with unease. When he closed the book, his face had become a careful mask. "This is concerning," Marin said slowly. "If you'll excuse me for a moment, I need to consult with the fort's commander about this matter." He picked up the ledger and left the office, closing the door behind him. Minutes stretched like hours in the stuffy room. Hazel paced while Sebastian stood silent, watching through the window as snow began to fall again. The door suddenly burst open, and 4 soldiers entered with rifles ready. Behind them came Marin, the ledger tucked under his arm. "Sebastian Yoder," Marin announced formally. "You are under arrest for interfering with federal operations and attempting to disrupt legitimate railroad business." "No!" Hazel cried out as one soldier produced iron shackles. "The ledger proves the foreman's crimes. Why are you protecting him?" Marin's lips curved in a thin smile. "The ledger is now evidence in a federal investigation. As for you, young woman, you'll be detained here until transport can be arranged back to Pine Junction." Understanding hit Hazel like a physical blow. "You're working with them," she whispered. "The railroad's paying you to look the other way." The agent didn't deny it. He simply gestured to his men, who began shackling Sebastian's wrists. Sebastian offered no resistance as the cold iron closed around his arms. His eyes found Hazel's, full of sorrow, but not defeat. "Hold to truth," he whispered as they led him toward the door. "God's not done yet." Hazel nodded through her tears, straightening her spine. Even as her heart broke watching them take Sebastian away, she felt steel entering her soul. He had taught her that truth was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The door closed behind them, leaving her alone with Agent Marin. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, dusting the parade ground white. The flag above the fort hung motionless, as if ashamed to wave over such injustice. "You'll be housed with the laundress until we can arrange your return," Marin said, not meeting her eyes. He gathered papers from his desk, tucking the damning ledger among them. "I suggest you forget what you think you know about railroad operations. Some matters are bigger than individual complaints." Hazel said nothing. Sebastian's words echoed in her mind. Hold to truth. As a soldier arrived to escort her away, she silently promised to do just that. God might not be done yet, but neither was she. Iron bars rattled as the prison wagon jolted over another rut in the dirt road. Hazel pressed her face against the cold metal, watching Sebastian's broad back where he rode between two mounted soldiers. His hands were bound, but his head remained high, the way he'd taught her to carry herself. Other prisoners huddled around her in the cage, mostly drifters caught sleeping in railroad cars or natives who'd wandered too close to white settlements. The winter sun hung low and pale in the afternoon sky. Hazel's breath made little clouds as she hummed the hymn Sebastian had sung that first night from the auction. "Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart." The familiar melody steadied her racing thoughts. During their midday stop, she'd watched a young Cherokee boy gathering firewood for the soldiers' cook fires. Something in his careful movements, the quiet dignity in his face, reminded her of Preacher Greyhawk. While the guards were distracted with their coffee, she'd torn a strip from her petticoat and scratched out a message with a bit of charcoal. "Tell Preacher Greyhawk at the River Chapel. Sebastian and Hazel captured. Ledger seized. Need help. God's truth must prevail." When the boy came near the wagon to collect more kindling, she'd dropped the note at his feet. His dark eyes had met hers for just a moment before he palmed the message and melted away into the trees. He hadn't spoken a word, but his slight nod told her the message would reach its destination. Now, as afternoon faded toward evening, Hazel watched Sebastian carefully. The soldiers had been rough with him that morning, leaving bruises on his face and arms. Yet he rode straight-backed in his saddle, occasionally murmuring prayers in Pennsylvania Dutch. The younger guard, barely more than a boy himself, kept glancing at Sebastian with uncertain eyes. "Why don't you curse us?" the young soldier finally asked. "Most prisoners do." Sebastian's voice carried clearly on the cold air. "The Lord teaches us to forgive our enemies. I reckon that includes those who are just following orders they don't rightly understand." The soldier shifted in his saddle. "You saying I don't understand what I'm doing?" "I'm saying you've got a choice," Sebastian replied gently. "Same as we all do. Between what's lawful and what's right, between cruelty and mercy." Something in those words seemed to reach the young man. When they stopped to water the horses at sunset, he deliberately tied Sebastian's ropes with less force than before. The knots, while looking secure, had just enough give that strong hands might work them loose. Hazel noticed this exchange through the bars of the wagon cage. Her heart lifted to see how Sebastian's quiet faith could touch even those who held him captive. She remembered his words about truth walking slow but steady, and she felt her own faith growing stronger. No longer was she the frightened girl from the auction block. Sebastian had shown her a better way, facing hardship with dignity and trust in God's plan. The wagon train continued as darkness fell. Pine Junction's lights appeared in the distance, yellow pinpricks against the purple dusk. Hazel knew what waited there: the foreman's anger, Agent Marin's corruption, and all the old fears she'd carried for so long. But somehow those lights no longer seemed as threatening as before. She straightened her back, just as Sebastian had taught her. The hymn rose from her throat again, stronger this time. Other prisoners in the wagon began humming along, the melody weaving through the chill evening air like a prayer. Sebastian turned slightly in his saddle at the sound. Though too far to speak, he nodded once, and Hazel saw pride in his eyes. She wasn't just his rescued charge anymore. She was becoming someone who could stand tall in her own right, someone who could fight for truth with courage instead of cowering in fear. The town lights grew larger, each one like a star of judgment waiting to pass sentence on their fate. But Hazel kept humming, her voice clear and steady. She thought of the Cherokee boy with her message, already running through the darkness toward Preacher Greyhawk's chapel. She thought of Sebastian's quiet strength and the young soldier's moment of mercy with the ropes. Most of all, she thought about how far she'd come from that cold day at the labor auction. She was no longer the fat girl everyone mocked. She was Hazel, Sebastian's friend, a bearer of truth, and a child of God. Whatever waited in Pine Junction, she would face it with the dignity she'd learned from the gentle giant who'd saved her. The wagon rolled onward through the gathering dark, carrying its cargo of prisoners toward whatever justice or injustice morning would bring. But this time, Hazel rode toward her fears with faith instead of trembling. Sebastian had shown her the way, and now she would walk it, one steady step at a time. Morning sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of Pine Junction's makeshift courtroom. The space above the livery stable, usually reserved for hay storage, creaked under the weight of curious townsfolk packed shoulder to shoulder. The scent of horses and leather wafted up through the floorboards, mixing with the nervous sweat of the gathered crowd. Judge Amos Hewitt sat behind a makeshift desk, his silver watch chain glinting as he drummed his fingers against the worn wood. His lip curled with disdain as he regarded Sebastian Yoder, who stood straight and tall in his plain clothes, hands still bearing rope burns from his bonds. "This court will come to order," Hewitt announced, though the shuffling crowd barely quieted. "We're here to address charges of theft and interference with company operations." Foreman Gus Ketterly lounged in the witness chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing across his face. His boots were polished to a shine that matched the arrogance in his eyes. "That girl," he jabbed a finger toward Hazel, "is company property under legal contract. And this man," he gestured at Sebastian, "helped her steal valuable business records." Hazel stood beside Sebastian, her hands clasped tightly to stop their trembling. The wooden floor beneath her feet seemed to sway as dozens of eyes bored into her. Some faces showed pity, others scorn, but most held only idle curiosity about the morning's entertainment. Judge Hewitt peered down at her over his spectacles. "Well, girl, what do you have to say for yourself?" The room fell silent. Hazel felt Sebastian's quiet strength beside her, remembering his words about truth walking slow but steady. She lifted her chin and took a deep breath. "I took that ledger," she declared, her voice starting soft but growing stronger, "because it showed how they were enslaving Indian children and widows. The foreman was charging them for food and blankets they never got, keeping them in debt they could never pay off." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back called out, "That's just business, girl." "Silence." Judge Hewitt's gavel cracked against the desk. "This court will have order." He fixed Hazel with a stern glare. "Do you have any proof of these serious accusations?" "The ledger," Hazel began, "is federal evidence," Ketterly cut in smoothly. "Safe in Agent Marin's custody where it belongs." The judge nodded, satisfied. "Then I see no reason to delay judgment. This court finds—" A sound cut through his words, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching outside. The crowd stirred, heads turning toward the door. The beats grew louder, closer, until they stopped directly below. The door burst open, sending a shaft of morning light across the dim room. Preacher Elijah Greyhawk stood in the doorway, his black coat dusted with road dirt, but his bearing dignified and determined. Behind him crowded several of Pine Junction's most respected citizens, the storekeeper, the blacksmith, 3 church deacons, and their wives. "Your Honor," Greyhawk's voice filled the room. "I believe you'll want to see this before passing judgment." He strode forward, pulling papers from his coat. The crowd parted before him like water. Judge Hewitt's gavel hung forgotten in his hand as the preacher approached. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" "These are copies of certain pages from the foreman's ledger," Greyhawk explained, laying the papers on the judge's desk. "Made by honest folks who couldn't stay silent once they saw the truth." The storekeeper stepped forward. "I made those copies myself, Your Honor, before Agent Marin took the original. Every entry shows how they trapped people in debt, working them half to death." Ketterly surged to his feet. "This is nonsense. You can't accept copied papers as evidence." "Can't I?" Judge Hewitt had begun reading, his face growing pale. "These entries are quite detailed, Mr. Ketterly. Names, dates, false charges." His hands trembled slightly as he turned a page. "Children listed as debtors." The crowd pressed closer, murmuring. Hazel felt tears welling in her eyes as she watched the truth finally emerging into the light. Sebastian's hand found her shoulder, steady and warm. Preacher Greyhawk's voice cut through the growing noise. "There are witnesses ready to testify, Your Honor. Dozens who've suffered under this system. The question is, will this court hear them?" Judge Hewitt's gavel wavered in his grip as he looked from the damning papers to Ketterly's darkening face, then to the determined eyes of the townsfolk who had brought this evidence forward. The morning sun streamed stronger through the windows now, as if heaven itself waited to see justice done. Preacher Greyhawk cleared his throat, his weathered hands holding the copied pages with reverence. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he began to read in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the crowded room. "April 15th, he began. Sarah Whitefeather, age 13, charged $8 for blanket never received. May 2nd, Thomas Running Bear's 3 children, ages 7 through 11, charged $15 each for winter boots, marked as damaged goods, though never delivered." The room grew still as death. Even the horses below seemed to sense the weight of the moment, their usual stamps and snorts falling silent. "June 18th, Greyhawk continued, his voice gaining strength. William Carter's widow and 4 children charged $30 for spoiled flour. July 3rd, Mary Redhawk, age 15, wages withheld for alleged theft of tools never found." Page after page, name after name, the cruel arithmetic of greed unfolded. Mothers separated from children, elders worked until they collapsed, all trapped in an endless cycle of manufactured debt. Some in the crowd began to weep softly. Others stood rigid, fists clenched at their sides. Foreman Ketterly's face had turned the color of spoiled meat. With a roar, he lunged forward, reaching for the damning papers in Greyhawk's hands. "Those are company property." But he never reached them. 3 townsmen, the blacksmith and 2 deacons, grabbed his arms, wrestling him back. He thrashed in their grip like a wounded animal, all pretense of dignity abandoned. Judge Hewitt's face had gone pale as chalk. His hands trembled as he set down his gavel, the sharp rap of authority replaced by the quiet whisper of conscience. "Deputy," he called, voice hoarse, "take Mr. Ketterly into custody." The deputy stepped forward, iron cuffs ready. The foreman's protests echoed off the rafters as he was led away. "Mr. Yoder," the judge continued, not quite meeting Sebastian's steady gaze. "The charges against you are dismissed. You are free to go." Sebastian stepped down from the defendant's space, his boots making solid thuds against the wooden floor. The same crowd that had mocked him days before now broke into spontaneous applause, their faces transformed by shame and admiration. Hazel could hold back no longer. She rushed forward, tears streaming down her face, and clutched Sebastian's sleeve as if he might disappear. His strong hand covered hers, warm and real and free. "Your Honor." Sebastian's quiet voice somehow carried over the noise. If I might make a request? Judge Hewitt nodded, looking almost eager to grant some mercy after enabling so much cruelty. The money and property seized from the foreman, Sebastian said carefully. I ask that it be used to establish a labor school for destitute girls, a place where they can learn honest work and letters, safe from those who'd use them poorly. The judge hesitated, his fingers drumming against his desk. The crowd held its breath, waiting. Finally, he nodded with solemn deliberation. A fitting resolution, he declared. I'll draw up the papers myself. Preacher Greyhawk moved forward, placing one hand on Sebastian's broad shoulder and the other on Hazel's trembling one. Mercy's the highest justice, he said softly, but his words seemed to fill the whole room. It heals both the wounded and the ones who caused the wound. The morning sun streamed through the windows in full force now, turning dust motes to golden sparks. They danced around Sebastian and Hazel like visible proof of grace, as the crowd began to press forward with handshakes, tears, and whispered apologies. Through it all, Sebastian stood straight and calm, accepting their words with the same quiet dignity he'd shown under their scorn. Hazel remained close to his side, her tears slowly giving way to wondering smiles as townspeople who'd once mocked her size now praised her courage. Judge Hewitt signed the official papers with a flourishing hand, as if eager to begin setting right what had gone so wrong. The black ink dried in the sunlight, marking not just the end of injustice, but the beginning of hope for those who would come after. The autumn wind whispered through pine boughs as Sebastian and Hazel worked together, transforming the old smokehouse into something entirely new. Sawdust sparkled in shafts of morning light as they scraped decades of smoke from the wooden walls. The familiar scents of cured meat and hickory gradually gave way to fresh-cut lumber and chalk dust. "Reckon we ought to put the benches along this wall," Hazel said, gesturing with a cloth-wrapped hand. Her voice carried a confidence that grew stronger each day. Sebastian nodded, a gentle smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Yeah, good thinking. The light will fall better for reading." Mrs. Cooper, the widow who ran the general store, arrived with her wagon piled high with gifts, chalk, slate boards, and sturdy wooden benches that her late husband had crafted for the church. "Every child deserves a proper place to learn," she declared, helping them arrange the furniture. Throughout the week, townspeople who had once turned away now came bearing offerings: hammers, nails, primer books, and even colorful curtains for the windows. Each visitor seemed eager to be part of this new beginning. In the afternoons, neighborhood children began appearing, drawn by curiosity. Hazel gathered them around her on the grass, reading aloud from old hymnals with patient joy. Her clear voice carried across the hillside, accompanied by young giggles and eager questions. The sound of their laughter echoed off the ridges like music. As evening approached each day, Sebastian would chop wood while Hazel tended the cooking fire, stirring thick stew in the iron pot. They moved around each other with the easy rhythm of family, sharing quiet smiles and comfortable silence. The cabin felt warmer somehow, as if their contentment had seeped into its very walls. One evening, as they sat down to supper, Sebastian noticed an envelope bearing the distinctive script of his old community. Inside was a letter from Bishop Stoltzfus, offering forgiveness for his past actions and inviting him to return to Lancaster. Sebastian read it through twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. Hazel watched him with worried eyes. "Will you go back?" she asked softly. Sebastian shook his head, his voice gentle but firm. "My home's right here." Tears welled in Hazel's eyes as she stirred her stew. After a moment, she looked up at him and whispered, "Thank you." "Pa." The word hung in the air like a prayer answered. Sebastian reached across the table and squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the valley in white. Lantern light glowed from cabins scattered across the hillsides, each one a beacon of warmth against the gathering dark. Inside their own home, Sebastian and Hazel sat together in peaceful silence, watching the flakes swirl past their window, finally and truly belonging. Snow lay thick upon the ground as winter settled deep into the valley. The transformed smokehouse stood proud beneath its coating of white, its new wooden sign creaking gently in the wind. Mercy works here. Sebastian had carved the letters himself, each stroke a testament to their journey from darkness to light. Inside, warmth from the pot-bellied stove filled the single room, where rough-hewn benches now held a dozen eager students. Children from town sat shoulder to shoulder with those from the railroad camps and outlying homesteads, their differences forgotten in shared learning. "Sound it out careful now," Hazel encouraged a small girl struggling with her letters. Her voice carried the same gentleness Sebastian had shown her that first cold day at the auction. The other students leaned in, whispering support instead of mockery. Preacher Greyhawk visited often, his weathered boots leaving snow-wet prints on the plank floor. This morning, he stood before them all, hands raised in blessing. "Creator of all things," he prayed in both English and Cherokee, "guide these little ones in wisdom and love." Sebastian and Hazel moved through the room, passing out slices of fresh-baked bread still warm from their cabin's oven. The same townspeople who had once jeered now sent their daughters with hopeful notes. "Please teach her like you did the others." They had seen how Hazel's students grew not just in knowledge but in kindness. As the winter sun sank early behind frost-covered pines, Sebastian sat in his familiar chair by the fire, his large hands, calloused from years of work, folded in quiet prayer. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for making something beautiful from our brokenness." Hazel watched him from the doorway, then walked to the hearth where the small wooden carving of a child had stood so long in lonely vigil. With gentle reverence, she lifted it and carried it to the schoolhouse. There she placed it on the shelf beside her worn primer book, touching it softly before stepping back. The carved figure seemed to glow in the fading light, no longer just a memorial to Sebastian's lost son, but a symbol of how love could heal the deepest wounds. Together they had built something neither could have imagined in their darkest days. Outside, snow continued its silent dance as the small bell that hung by the schoolhouse door rang out for evening prayers. Its clear tone carried across the valley, calling their newfound family to give thanks for all that had been lost and found again. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.